Hi, it's time for another verb of the day. Today's verb is delude. And this verb was recommended by the viewer Luis. So Luis, thank you so much for sharing another great idea with us. Now let's take a moment and review some of the definitions or the ways that we can use the verb delude. The first way you might encounter this verb delude means to impose a misleading belief upon someone. Here you're sort of convincing them something that isn't actually true, but you're making them think it is. Related to that is that second definition, to deceive or fool. So again, we're kind of trying to trick someone into believing something that is not accurate. Now, what you're going to observe in a few minutes are many reflexive pronouns with this verb. So sometimes it's not another person convincing us, deceiving us, or fooling us. It might be our own selves kind of trying to convince us something is true, even though we probably know that it isn't. For now, you should know that delude is a regular verb. To make the progressive form, we're going to drop the E on the end because we have a verb that ends in the pattern vowel consonant E. We'll add ing, and that forms deluding. The past tense and the participle form of the verb can be made by just adding D since this verb already ends in an E. Now the base verb delude, ends in a D sound. And this means when we add that ed ending, we are going to add an extra syllable. We're going to make an id sound. So the past tense and the participle form of the verb should sound like this: deluded, deluded. Now, there are a couple phrasal verbs you might encounter. We'll look at those, but you'll notice the meanings are very close to what we've already discussed here. The first phrasal verb you might encounter is to delude into. So again, you're causing someone to believe something that is not true. An example of this: please don't delude them into thinking this is a dangerous activity. So here, someone is maybe getting others worried, getting them to feel anxious about some perceived danger when there really isn't any danger. Another phrasal verb you might encounter is to delude with. That can mean to use something to induce someone to believe falsehoods, to believe lies. An example of this: they deluded the children with promises of candy, and the children lost their minds when they didn't get any. So again, they might have been promising, if you do this, we'll give you candy. The children did whatever they were asked to, but then they didn't get it. So they, again, kind of maybe sort of flipped out, freaked out, as you might expect. Now, let's move on and look at some more examples, and then we'll review our verb tenses. Today, I thought it would be good to talk about the past progressive and the present perfect. Let's start with the past progressive. We use this verb tense to discuss an action that was ongoing or that was continuing in the past. Some teachers or textbooks use past continuous to describe this verb tense, and that is perfectly fine. I like using past progressive because the two P's can help you remember you'll need two parts to make your verb. In the affirmative, we're going to have to pay attention to our subject. If our subject is I, he, she, or it, we'll use was, that's the past tense form of be, and then we'll use the ing form of the verb. But if your subject is you, we, or they, you'll use were, W-E-R-E, and then the ing form of the verb. You can see that in my example here. They were deluding themselves into thinking there was no way their company could fire all of them. Okay. So maybe there are signs this company is not performing well. They're not making money. Things are bad, and so people are trying again to sort of tell myself or tell Each person is trying to tell him or herself, right? I'm going to be fine. I'm not going to lose my job, even though there's a lot of evidence to the contrary. Now let's talk about making negative past progressive sentences. To do this, again, pay attention to your subject. You'll use either was or were, then not, and then that ing form of the verb. You might also encounter the contraction form, wasn't and weren't. Let's take a look at an example. He wasn't deluding himself into thinking he could solve all of the department's problems. So here, he has not convinced himself of this falsehood. Finally, let's look at making a yes or no question in the past progressive. To do this, you start with was or were, whatever form matches your subject, that subject comes next. Then we'll have the ing form the verb. Here's a question. Was I deluding myself when I brought my violin to college? I saw this question posed by someone who was writing. They really loved playing music, but they just didn't see themselves as being very good. And so they weren't sure, could they qualify or make different orchestras or musical performing groups? So that's why, am I convincing myself I can do this and bringing this instrument with me when in reality it's not going to happen? Now let's move on and talk about the present perfect. We can use this verb tense in a couple different ways. One way is to talk about an action that occurred at some unknown point in the past. Sometimes this is called the indefinite past tense. So it may have occurred one time in the past, and it may have occurred last week or 10 years ago. We don't know, and it might not matter for what you're trying to communicate. But another way this verb tense gets used is to talk about an action that started in the past and continues into the present. You'll notice present perfect has two P's, so again, you're going to need two parts to make your verb tense. And this is yet another verb tense where we need to pay attention to our subjects. So if our subject is I, you, we, or they, use have, and then our participle form of the verb. But if your subject is he, she, or it, we'll use has, and then the participle form of the verb. Let's take a look at the affirmative example. Republicans have deluded themselves into thinking a second Trump administration would be identical to the first. Now, if you are someone who follows the news and follows politics, you might understand there is just a lot going on here in the United States. And some people are rather surprised by how our current president has been acting. Others think, you were lying to yourself if you thought he was going to act better, act differently. So that's what that sentence is conveying. Now let's move on to a negative present perfect sentence. Again, to do that, pay attention to your subject. Use either have not and the participle form of the verb, or has not and then the participle. Again, you may see contractions, haven't and hasn't. Here's an example. She hasn't deluded herself into thinking her devotion will lead to a promotion. Okay. And finally, let's look at making a yes or no question in the present perfect. To do this, you will see either have or has, whatever form matches that subject, the subject comes next, and then the participle form of a verb. Here's another example. Have they deluded themselves into thinking they are actually nice guys? Okay, so I mentioned earlier in the video that it's really common to see reflexive pronouns. So you'll notice the word themselves, himself, myself, herself used in these examples. And if that's something maybe you haven't studied a lot of, I'll just kind of quickly review why we have those words. We have them when the subject of a sentence, so the person doing the action, is the same as the person receiving the action. So in all of these sentences, we are either talking about or asking about someone who is convincing themselves of something that isn't true. So now let's move on and talk about some words that are related to our verb delude. And we're going to start with the noun. The noun form of this word is delusion. This is, again, describing a false belief or a false judgment about some true thing, some external reality. And many times we use this when there is evidence to the contrary. And you may also encounter this to describe certain mental conditions that individuals may be experiencing. So you might see this used in connection with hallucinations, right? So kind of imagining things. But again, that idea now that you're convincing something is true that isn't really true. So an example of this, again, this is something I have read in the news related to the ongoing conflict in Gaza. Some argue for a two-state solution, while others say that is a delusion. So again, I am not going to try and solve that conflict in this video. That seems impossible. But there are many people who are presently studying, have studied, have thoughts about how these two groups of individuals can live in a peaceful way. Some argue, right, we need two countries. That's what's meant by two-state solution. Others say, oh, that's false. That will never work. Now, let's move on to another word. It's the adjective delusional. So we took the noun, added that al suffix to make it an adjective. So here we're describing something that is characterized by or holding false beliefs or judgments, again, about external reality, despite there being evidence that would show this thing is not true. So an example of this. The coach called his players delusional after they blamed the loss on the referees. So here, this is a common thing that happens in sports where people are like, we lost that game because of something else. And here, coach is saying, no, that's false. He's mainly probably implying they did not play well enough to win. Another related word that some people are hearing more, so I would say this is really popular slang with teenagers and has been for the last year or two. You might hear someone use the word delulu. And again, the meaning here is really delusional. So as teens use this particular word, they are oftentimes describing someone that has unrealistic beliefs or unrealistic expectations. An example of this: you're delulu if you think our instructor will just cancel the exam. So you can imagine maybe two high school students speaking to each other. One is somehow hopeful that we just aren't going to have to take a test. Another person saying, oh, that is unrealistic. One more word for us today. It's the adverb deludedly. Oh, we might use this adverb to describe an action where someone is under a delusion or they're being deceived by some false beliefs. So an example of this: the court heard evidence the man stabbed his mother after deludedly thinking that she was a danger to his sister. So again, this particular sentence I took from a newspaper article. The defense for this particular person who's been accused of a crime is that he suffers from mental illness. And so they're trying to show and establish that he didn't understand kind of external reality, what was really happening, and was instead sort of controlled by these false beliefs and again, probably some other conditions that led to this horrible act. So thanks again to Louise for suggesting today's verb. I thank you all for watching, and I hope you have a great day.